On a spring afternoon in 2005, Robert Blake stood in a Los Angeles courtroom trembling as a jury foreman read out the verdict. The 71-year-old actor, who was once a swashbuckling TV detective admired by millions, now cut a very different figure. A spectral, white-haired murder defendant, as one reporter put it. Moments later, Blake collapsed into sobs of relief. Not guilty. It was one heck of a scene, yet it was just one chapter in a life that contained extraordinary fame, devastating scandal, and a public trial more bizarre than any role he ever played. Welcome to Hollywood Mysteries. Robert Blake was born Michael James Gubitosi in Nutley, New Jersey on September 18, 1933. Show business was practically encoded in his DNA. His parents, Giacomo, also known as James Gubitosi, and Elizabeth Cafone, were a song and dance vaudeville duo who put their 3 children on stage almost as soon as they could walk. By age 2, Little Mickey, as he was known, was performing in the family act, billed as one of the 3 little hillbillies in Depression-era roadhouses. When I got to the sidewalk and started dancing, that's when I found love, Blake later said of those toddler days on stage. People threw money. When you're 2 years old, you don't have to do much to be cute, but I was talented. In 1938, the Gubitosis moved to Los Angeles to chase Hollywood dreams. It didn't take long for Mickey to be discovered. At age 5, he and his siblings literally wandered into an MGM casting office and charmed the staff with an impromptu song and dance routine. The precocious boy soon landed work as a movie extra, and by 1939 he snagged the role that made him a bona fide child star, Mickey in Hal Roach's popular Our Gang comedy shorts, also known as the Little Rascals. For 5 years, from 1939 through 1944, Mickey Gubitosi's cherubic face appeared in dozens of Our Gang short films, such as 1939's Dad for a Day and Don't Lie from 1942. He became one of the series' most recognizable kids, so much so that the studio actually had him adopt his character's name and he was credited as Bobby Blake on screen. Yet even as he mugged and sang for the cameras with adorable confidence, the real life of young Mickey Gubitosi was anything but lighthearted. Behind closed doors, he later revealed his childhood was a nightmare of abuse. Blake described both his parents as insane and claimed his father, an alcoholic, was brutally cruel. He said he was frequently beaten, locked in a closet, forced to eat off the floor, and even sexually abused as a little boy. At age 10, he was so miserable that he lashed out at school, getting into fights until he was expelled. At 14, Blake ran away from home, drifting and struggling through his mid-teens. It hurt because America is the only family I had, Blake reflected decades later about those painful early years. His father, James, died by suicide in 1956, and the funeral was an event Blake pointedly did not attend. Despite the trauma at home, Blake's talent kept opening doors in Hollywood. As a child and teen, he racked up credits, playing Little Beaver in 22 films of the Red Ryder Western series in the 1940s, appearing as a young John Garfield in Humoresque, and in a bit of cinematic trivia, portraying the boy who sells Humphrey Bogart a crucial lottery ticket in the classic The Treasure of the Sierra Madre in 1948. By the time he was a young adult, Blake had one of the longest resumes in town, and he had successfully navigated the treacherous transition from child actor to grown-up roles. After a stint in the Army, he returned to acting with a new intensity and a more grown-up version of his new name, Robert Blake. If much of Blake's youth had been spent in bit parts and B-movies, the mid-1960s finally brought him the roles that would showcase the full depth of his talent. He took on guest spots on TV series and small film roles, a war movie here, a biblical epic there, steadily building his craft. Then in 1967 came his breakthrough, the role of real-life killer Perry Smith in Cold Blood, director Richard Brooks' stark film adaptation of the Truman Capote bestseller. At 33, Robert Blake was still relatively unknown to mainstream audiences, but In Cold Blood changed that almost overnight. As the sensitive yet psychopathic Perry Smith, one of 2 drifters who slaughter a farm family in Kansas, Blake delivered a performance of chilling authenticity. Critics hailed it as a tour de force. The New York Times praised Blake's haunting embodiment of Smith's tortured soul, and many expected an Oscar nomination, though one never materialized. For Blake, it was a career-defining role, but also a personally harrowing one. Immersing himself in the dark mind of a murderer took a psychological toll on the actor. Blake later admitted that after In Cold Blood, he fell into a deep depression and needed psychiatric help. The role had cut so close to the bone that he couldn't work for 2 years. "I was in bad shape after that," he told People magazine, and he went on to describe how playing a killer dredged up his own demons. Fortunately, Blake had support at home. In 1961, he had married actress Sandra Kerr, whom he'd met backstage at a play. During this tough period, Sandra stood by him as he began therapy that Blake would continue for more than 30 years to battle his inner traumas. On a happier note, the couple had 2 children, Noah, born in 1965, and Delina, who followed in 1966. By 1969, Blake had emerged from his In Cold Blood hiatus, stronger and ready to capitalize on his newfound acclaim. He took on another challenging lead, this time in 1969's Tell Them Willie Boy Is Here, which was a politically charged Western where he portrayed a Paiute Indian on the run. He followed up with the title role in Electra Glide in Blue from 1973, playing a righteous motorcycle cop in a cynical post-60s America. These films didn't reach the iconic status of In Cold Blood, but they certainly solidified Blake's reputation as a compelling leading man unafraid of complex characters. Off-screen, however, his personal storm clouds had not cleared, and they would soon collide with the biggest success of his career. In 1975, Robert Blake landed the role that made him a household name, undercover New York detective Tony Beretta in the ABC television series Beretta. The show was a gritty crime drama with something of a playful streak, which was a combination perfectly tailored to Blake's persona. As Beretta, he wisecracked in a New Jersey accent, prowled the streets in disguise, and even kept a pet cockatoo named Fred perched on his shoulder, a classic 70s touch that viewers loved. Blake had a knack for portraying tough guys with soft hearts, and Detective Beretta was exactly that. With his trademark t-shirt and flat cap, and his cheeky catchphrase, "Don't do the crime if you can't do the time," Beretta became one of the era's most memorable TV characters. The series was a huge hit, running from 1975 to 1978, and Blake's performance was the focus of the praise. In 1975, he won the Emmy Award for Outstanding Lead Actor in a Drama Series for Beretta, beating out some of television's biggest names. He'd be nominated again for the role in 1977. He even snagged a Golden Globe in 1976 in a tie with Telly Savalas of Kojak for Best Actor on TV. Critics loved Blake's magnetic energy and streetwise authenticity. Tony Beretta felt less like a scripted hero and more like a real person you might meet on a Brooklyn street corner. For a moment in the mid-70s, Robert Blake was on top of the entertainment world, a TV superstar whose face graced magazine covers and whose lines were quoted in schoolyards. Yet behind the scenes, the very qualities that made Blake such a fiery performer were creating chaos on set. By this time, he had developed a reputation for often volatile behavior on production. Beretta's set, several crew members later said, was racked by tensions and fighting fueled by its temperamental star. Blake demanded realism and perfection, and he wasn't shy about bawling at writers, directors, or co-stars to get it. Decades later, tales of his on-set conduct became Hollywood lore. In one infamous incident in 1982, after Beretta had ended, Blake hosted an episode of Saturday Night Live. Unimpressed with the sketch written for him, he reportedly crumpled up the script and hurled it into a cast member's face, an outburst that got him banned from SNL for life. The man who could hold audiences rapt with his intensity on camera could also terrify colleagues with that same intensity off camera. Blake himself admitted that during those years he was wrestling with serious personal demons, including substance abuse. In candid appearances on talk shows, he bared his soul about his history of drug use. "I've sold dope, used it, snorted it, done everything you can do to it," he confessed to host Merv Griffin at the height of Beretta's fame. The honesty only enhanced his outlaw image, but it showed there was also a darker truth. Blake was a man in constant battle with himself. Sandra, his wife, had small roles on Beretta and saw his struggles up close. The pressures of stardom, combined with Blake's unresolved childhood trauma and now a cocaine habit, were taking a toll. By the end of Beretta, I was pretty messed up, he later said in interviews. Indeed, when Beretta ended in 1978, Blake stepped back from acting for a time. He wouldn't return to the screen until 1980, when he attempted a mini-Hollywood comeback in feature films. He co-starred with Diane Cannon in the road trip comedy Coast to Coast, and with Barbara Harris in Secondhand Hearts. But neither movie caught fire with audiences or critics. Blake, it seemed, was better suited to hard-edged drama than light comedy. He soon refocused on television, and he leveraged his clout to create and star in a trio of TV movies as hard-boiled Private Eye, Joe Dancer. Blake took on more creative control, and he was an executive producer on these projects. He even began adapting classic literature. He produced and starred in a 1981 CBS adaptation of Mice and Men, playing George opposite Randy Quaid's Lenny. But even as he explored new roles, Blake's personal life was in an ever-deepening spiral. After over 20 years of marriage, he and Sandra separated in 1982, finalizing their divorce by 1983. The stability that had grounded him since the early 60s was crumbling, just as his professional footing also grew shaky. In 1985, Blake undertook an ambitious new television project that would prove to be his undoing, at least temporarily. He created and starred in the NBC series Helltown, playing an unconventional urban Catholic priest named Father Noah Hardstep Rivers who ministered to a tough East LA neighborhood. The character, a streetwise ex-gang member turned priest, had obvious parallels to Blake's own tough guy with the heart persona. But mounting and starring in a weekly series so soon after his divorce and amidst lingering addiction issues pushed Blake to a breaking point. Helltown debuted in 1985 but lasted only 13 episodes, canceled abruptly after Blake quit the show as he had suffered what he later described as a complete nervous breakdown. The stress of Helltown and other projects combined with his personal turmoil nearly drove Blake to suicide. "I'd be so uptight I could hardly breathe. My heart hurt. My soul hurt," he told the Los Angeles Times of that period. "During Helltown, I only remember being terrified," he recalled. "One morning I realized I was only days, maybe hours away from sticking a gun in my mouth and pulling the trigger." It was a chilling admission from a man who had played out so much violence on screen. Robert Blake was now contemplating ending his own life. He nonetheless understood the severity of his crisis, and he walked away from the show and the industry to seek help. He later said he got back into intensive therapy with a new psychiatrist and was determined to confront the lifelong accumulation of pain that had finally overwhelmed him. Blake would remain largely absent from Hollywood for the next 7 years. During this hiatus in the late 1980s, he lived quietly, far from cameras, trying to rebuild his mental health. He described those years as a period of healing and self-reflection, a chance to finally address the wreckage of his past rather than papering over it with work. By the early 1990s and his late 50s, Robert Blake felt stable enough to give acting another try. In 1993, he made an unlikely comeback with a television movie that uncannily mirrored aspects of his own psyche. He took the title role in Judgment Day, The John List Story, where he played John List, a soft-spoken New Jersey accountant and devout churchgoer who infamously murdered his entire family and disappeared for 18 years. Blake's return to the screen in this true crime drama was met with critical praise. He was once again recognized by his peers for outstanding acting, taking home the 1993 Emmy for Outstanding Lead Actor in a Limited Series or Special for playing John List. It was a triumphant professional validation, yet Blake's victory was tinged with eerie irony. He was being lauded for embodying a murderer, an unsettling prefiguration of events soon to come. At the time, though, Blake hoped it would mark a fresh chapter in his career. "I'd like to give my best performance," he told the Associated Press. "I'm not ready for a dog and fishing pole yet. I'd like to go to bed each night desperate to wake up each morning and create some magic." This heartfelt optimism came after the darkest period of his life, and tragically it would be crushed by darker days still to come. Blake's post-comeback film roles in the 1990s were relatively few but notable. He had a supporting turn as a fiery transit cop boss in Money Train, and a small but totally unforgettable part in 1997's Lost Highway, David Lynch's nightmarish neo-noir. In Lost Highway, Blake played a ghoulish, white-faced figure known only as the Mystery Man, a creepy embodiment of evil that lingered unsettlingly in the minds of viewers. It would be his final film role, and for those of you who saw my video on Jack Nance a few weeks back, you'll probably have figured out that this episode is another in the loose series I'm doing on actors that worked with Lynch over the years, as a tribute to them and to one of my favorite filmmakers, who we sadly lost earlier this year. I'll put a link on screen now to the Jack Nance video, in case you missed it. After 1997 in his mid-60s, Blake stepped away from acting once more. This time it seemed he might really retire for good. He had achieved an enviable career spanning 6 decades, from childhood shorts in the 1930s to an iconic avant-garde Lynch thriller. But Robert Blake's most infamous role was about to take place off-screen, in the court of public opinion and the court of law. In the late 1990s, Robert Blake's life took a fateful turn when he crossed paths with Bonnie Lee Bakley, a woman with a checkered past nearly as colorful as his own. Feeling lonely after years of bachelorhood, Blake was hanging out at a jazz club in 1999 looking for companionship. There he met Bakley, a 43-year-old Arkansas-born woman who was a familiar figure on Hollywood's fringes, known for her history of romancing and often bilking older celebrities. Here I was, 67 or 68 years old. My life was on hold, my career was stalled out, Blake later reflected. I'd been alone for a long time. Bakley was a fun girl to be around and persistent, and Blake found himself attracted to her. Though he knew of her unsavory reputation as a grifter who chased famous men, he didn't push her away. In fact, he felt grateful. She took me out of the stands and put me back in the arena. I had something to live for, Blake said of Bakley. Their relationship was complicated from the start. In 2000, Bakley became pregnant. At first, she claimed the baby's father was Christian Brando, son of legendary actor Marlon Brando, and she had been seeing the younger Brando around the same time. But when the baby girl named Rose was born in June 2000, DNA tests proved the father was Robert Blake. The 67-year-old actor was floored. He met his daughter when she was 2 months old and was instantly besotted. "Rosie's my blood. Rosie is calling to me," he later said, explaining why he agreed to marry Bakley despite their unconventional, very uneasy courtship. "I have no doubt that Rosie and I are going to walk off into the sunset together," he said optimistically of his newborn child. Blake and Bakley married in November 2000, but there was little domestic bliss. By most accounts, theirs was a marriage in name only, entered into for the sake of baby Rose. They kept separate homes and mostly led separate lives. Blake wasn't a total fool, even if his trauma and love of his new daughter did cause him to turn a blind eye to certain major red flags. Bakley had a long history of fraud and scams. She ran Lonely Hearts mail schemes and had been wed perhaps 10 times prior, sometimes bigamously. She juggled multiple identities and relationships. Blake was well aware of his wife's past. Later, he would bluntly call Bakley a con artist who had people that she burned. Still, he maintained he bore her no ill will. "I had no reason to dislike Bakley," he insisted in an interview. "She gave me something to live for in Rose." But soon prosecutors would be painting a very different picture of Blake's feelings and intentions. On May 4th, 2001, just months into the marriage, there was a tragedy. That night, Robert Blake took Bonnie Lee Bakley to one of his favorite neighborhood restaurants, Vitello's Italian Eatery in Studio City, not far from their home. Around 9 p.m. after the couple finished dinner, they walked to Blake's car, which was parked on a dark side street around the corner. According to Blake, as the pair settled into his black dog Stealth, Bakley realized she left her purse inside the restaurant. Blake volunteered to go back and retrieve it, and also he later said to fetch a handgun he had been carrying that he accidentally dropped in the booth. Blake claimed he left Bakley alone in the car and returned to the restaurant for a few minutes. When he came back out, he found Bonnie slumped in the passenger seat bleeding. She had been shot in the head at close range. Panicked, Blake ran to a nearby house for help, screaming that his wife had been shot. Bonnie Lee Bakley, 44, was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. From the outset, the circumstances were bizarre and suspicious. Blake's story of leaving his wife alone in a car on a side street to retrieve a dropped pistol sounded strange to investigators. The gun he said he went to get, a vintage Italian revolver he carried for protection, was found inside the restaurant, and forensic tests later showed that it was not the murder weapon. Meanwhile, the actual murder weapon, a different handgun, was found tossed in a dumpster not far from the scene. There were no eyewitnesses to the shooting, no physical evidence like gunshot residue or blood on Blake's clothes, and Blake himself had called 911 from a nearby house, and he certainly appeared distraught. At first, Los Angeles police didn't charge him, citing lack of evidence and the possibility that someone else, perhaps an enemy from Bakley's past, could have targeted her. As Blake's defense would later emphasize, Bakley had made many enemies over the years in her life of cons and schemes. She had several ex-husbands and boyfriends who resented her. She was even facing serious charges in Tennessee for fraud at the time of her death. Nonetheless, suspicion swirled heavily around Blake. Here was a Hollywood actor whose wife, whom he admittedly didn't much love, had been executed in his absence in his own car. The tabloids had a field day with the Film Noir-like scenario. Over the next year, the LAPD quietly built a case. The break came when two stuntmen, once associates of Blake, came forward with explosive allegations. They claimed that months before the murder, Robert Blake had solicited them to kill Bonnie Lee Bakley. The stuntmen, Gary McLarty and Ronald Duffy Hambleton, had worked with Blake years earlier and had reputations as heavy drinkers and drug users. According to their later testimony, Blake approached them separately in early 2001, expressing desperation about his wife and baby, and hinting that he wanted Bakley eliminated. The men's stories were far from ironclad, but to investigators, this was the missing link. On April 18, 2002, nearly a year after the murder, Robert Blake was arrested and charged with killing his wife, as well as with 2 counts of solicitation of murder for allegedly trying to hire the stuntman. His longtime bodyguard, Earl Caldwell, was also arrested as an alleged accomplice. The case rocketed Robert Blake back into the spotlight, now under the harshest possible glare. Like O.J. Simpson less than a decade before, Blake became the defendant in a Tinseltown murder trial that attracted ravenous media coverage. It had all the elements of morbid celebrity drama, a faded star, a lurid crime, and a victim with a dubious reputation that muddied the waters. Blake, who had always craved the love of America as his surrogate family, was suddenly being vilified in the press as a possibly wife-killing villain. After decades in the industry, he found himself alone in a cell with few Hollywood friends publicly coming to his defense. Blake maintained his innocence steadfastly. He granted a jailhouse interview to ABC's Barbara Walters, looking haggard but vehement as he declared, "I did not kill my wife." Robert Blake's murder trial began in late 2004 and became a media spectacle by early 2005. Every day, cameras swarmed the courthouse as the once dapper actor arrived looking frail, white-haired, and haunted. Testimony painted 2 contrasting pictures of Bonnie Lee Bakley and of Blake himself. The prosecution portrayed Bakley as a hustler but a loving mother who had finally found some stability with Blake, only to be killed by him when she became inconvenient. They argued that Blake resented Bakley for trapping him into fatherhood and marriage, and that he wanted sole custody of baby Rose without the problem of Bakley in the way. Their star witnesses, the 2 stuntmen, claimed Blake had approached each of them months before the murder. That was the crux of the state's case, defense attorney M. Gerald Schwartzbach noted. 2 dubiously credible men with sordid histories and shifting stories. The defense, for its part, depicted Bakley as the ultimate femme fatale, a career grifter of men, as even prosecutors conceded, who might have been killed by any number of disgruntled victims of her scams. Blake's team suggested that perhaps Christian Brando, who of course was once by her named as Rose's father, had a motive to silence Bakley, though no evidence pointed to him. They underscored the lack of forensic evidence tying Blake to the crime. No gunshot residue on him, no blood, no witnesses seeing him near the car at the moment of the shooting. The murder weapon had never been linked to Blake in any way. If Blake truly planned to kill his wife, the defense argued, why would he do it in such a public, risky manner and then have no plan whatsoever for the aftermath? On March 16, 2005, after a grueling 3-month trial, the jury delivered its dramatic verdict. After 8 days of deliberation, they found Robert Blake not guilty of murder and not guilty of 1 count of solicitation, They deadlocked on a second solicitation count, which the judge then dismissed. In the courtroom, Blake dropped his head and sobbed openly as the words sank in. He hugged his attorney tightly, tears streaming down his face. Across the room, one of Bakley's daughters wept in shock and anger, later calling Blake a murderer who got away and vowing to find justice in civil court. Outside the courthouse, the acquitted actor faced a throng of reporters and cheering supporters. For the first time in nearly 4 years, he was a free man. Blake's reaction was a mix of gratitude, defiance, and poignant ruefulness. "This small band of dedicated warriors saved my life," he said of his legal team and private investigators. But he also bluntly addressed what the trial had cost him. "If you want to know how to go through $10 million in 5 years, ask me," Blake quipped darkly. "I'm broke, I need a job," he declared. In a surreal moment, Blake then bent down on the sidewalk and cut off the electronic ankle monitor he had worn under house arrest, holding it up as if to show the world he was unshackled at last. The criminal saga was over, but Blake's legal troubles were not. True to their promise, Bonnie Bakley's family filed a wrongful death civil lawsuit against him. In November 2005, just 8 months after the acquittal, a civil jury found Robert Blake liable for the wrongful death of his wife using the lower burden of proof standard. They voted 10-2 that Blake had intentionally caused Bakley's death and hit him with a whopping $30 million in damages to be paid to Bakley's 4 children. Blake, who had spent his fortune on his defense, was unable to pay. The judgment forced him to declare bankruptcy, listing millions in debt. He appealed the civil verdict, and appeals court later cut the damages in half to $15 million. Eventually, the case was settled confidentially for an undisclosed sum, reportedly much less, given Blake's insolvency. But the damage to his finances and reputation was done. Once a wealthy man, he spent millions on his defense and wound up living on Social Security and a Screen Actors Guild pension. In the court of public opinion, feelings about the verdict were sharply divided. Some saw Blake as an innocent man finally vindicated, others as a lucky defendant who beat the rap by a whisker. Blake himself remained bitter about how he had been treated. He never wavered in asserting his innocence and often expressed resentment that the case had ever been brought. In a 2011 memoir titled Tales of a Rascal, What I Did for Love, he recounted his version of events and his broader life story, though by then many felt his credibility was tainted. A year later, in 2012, Blake agreed to a rare television interview with CNN's Piers Morgan to promote the memoir. It turned combative quickly. The 78-year-old Blake grew agitated as Morgan pressed him about Bakley's murder. Blake defensively lashed out at the police who investigated him, claiming they ripped my guts out and left me beside the road to die. At one point, Blake lost his temper entirely, calling the professionally obnoxious Morgan a liar on live TV. The uncomfortable exchange seemed to encapsulate what Robert Blake had become in the public eye, a once admired actor now better known for his volatility and anger, unable or unwilling to escape the shadow of his wife's killing. After the civil trial and bankruptcy, Robert Blake largely disappeared from public view. He would never act again. The comeback he had wistfully hoped for did not materialize. Hollywood's doors were closed to him. No producer was willing to gamble on an aging actor so infamously tied to a murder case. In 2017, in a surprising footnote, he married again, this time to longtime friend Pamela Hudak, but that relationship was short, ending in divorce after 2 years. It may have been a final attempt at normalcy that couldn't withstand the weight of Blake's baggage. Instead, Blake spent his late 70s and 80s in relative solitude. According to his niece, he passed the time enjoying jazz music, playing his guitar, reading poetry, and watching many Hollywood classic films in his twilight years. It was as if he had been exiled by the art form that had given him his identity, but he could not stop dreaming of the on-screen world that had been his only homeland. Blake's relationship with his children also remained complex. His older children, Noah and Delina, had grown up and moved on with their lives, and they strictly maintained their privacy during the whole drama. His youngest daughter, Rose Lenore, the child at the center of the storm, was raised by Blake's adult daughter, Delina, and her husband. Blake did not see Rose at all during her childhood, a terrible irony when you consider that he only married Bonnie in the first place to be near to Rose. It wasn't until 2019, when Rose was 18, that she decided to reconnect with her biological father, By then, Rose had also visited her mother Bonnie's grave for the first time, after years of avoiding that reality. "I've dealt with my fair share of sadness in life," the young woman said, "but I know I'm going to be okay." Tellingly, Rose referred to Robert Blake not as Dad, but by his first name when they finally spoke. Their reunion was quiet and reportedly cordial, but the distance was evident. So much had been lost that could never be fully restored. On March 9, 2023, Robert Blake died at his home in Los Angeles. His niece Noreen Austin announced that the cause was by heart disease and that he passed away peacefully surrounded by family. Blake was 89 years old. Obituaries dutifully recounted his early screen moments. The Our Gang days in Cold Blood, Beretta, yet almost all gave equal or greater space to the sensational scandal that engulfed his later years. Once hailed as among the finest actors of his generation, Blake became better known as the center of a real-life murder trial, a story more bizarre than any in which he acted, the Associated Press obituary observed pointedly. Many who remembered the intensity of his performances also couldn't forget the image of him as an acquitted defendant, weeping with relief in a courtroom or raging on talk shows in his later years. Even the film industry struggled with how to commemorate Blake. At the Oscars ceremony just days after his death, host Jimmy Kimmel opted for a macabre joke rather than paying any form of respects. "If you think Robert Blake should be part of the In Memoriam montage, text Gimme a Blake to the number on your screen," Kimmel said, and it caused a little laughter and some groans. It was a pointed reference to the Academy's decision to exclude Blake from its annual memorial segment, presumably due to the notoriety of his past. The moment showed Hollywood's ambivalence. Blake had been one of their own, a star, an Emmy winner, but his infamy made him into, at best, a scapegoat, and at worst, nothing more than a joke, even in death. So how should one measure the life of Robert Blake? Was he the gifted actor who wowed audiences in Cold Blood, and brought a street cop to life so vividly in Beretta? Or was he the troubled man whose violent upbringing and personal flaws led him down a path of scandal? In truth, he was all of these things. His impact on Hollywood is undeniable. He delivered performances that influenced generations of actors. Quentin Tarantino once cited Blake's In Cold Blood turn as a reference for casting criminals with depth. And Beretta's catchphrase still lives on in the pop culture lexicon. Yet his life story also serves as a sobering Hollywood cautionary tale about the length of the shadows cast by childhood abuse, about the corrosive effect of fame, and about how a single tragic incident can eclipse a lifetime of work. In his final years, Robert Blake seemed to want forgiveness, if not from the public, then perhaps from life itself. "I'm a human being," he told Barbara Walters in a moment of raw vulnerability, while he was furiously protesting his innocence. Human indeed, capable of greatness and weakness in equal measure. And like the best of noir characters, even in judgment, we cannot help but feel a measure of empathy for the life of Robert Blake. That's about all I've got for you in this episode. Be sure to check back in next week, and I'll be doing more in this David Lynch series over the next few months. Thanks as always to the wonderful patrons and members who keep this channel alive. Until next week, sweet dreams.